for Tim McCoy.
In looking over this cowboy gear, a lot of people are apt to ask, does the cowboy just wear that stuff for effect, or is it useful? Well, of course, through the years, they may have fancied up a lot of their equipment, but every article that a cowboy has in his possession, everything he wears, everything he uses, is mighty important in the life of a cowboy. Now take this saddle, for instance. The saddle, of course, as the old Texas Rangers used to say, the saddle's our home and the sky is our roof. Well, that's what a cowboy works in. There's his workbench. And you see that horn on the saddle? Whenever he's roped a critter or a horse, he can take his galleys around that horn, and that acts as a snubbing post. And it has to be strong, because just think of the weight that's thrown on that saddle sometimes with a 1,000-pound steer on the end of a rope. So it has to be big and strong and stout, you see. Of course, some cowboys think that this thing was put on for another purpose. You've heard of grabbing leather? When a fellow's on a bucking horse, very often he'll reach down and get a hold of that thing to steady himself. But you know, every time I've ever been bucked off a horse, I never could find it. I always kept reaching for it, and I generally pick up a handful of sagebrush. I've known fellows that said, it's no sin to pull leather. If you get on a tough horse, reach down and get a hold of that thing. That's what the good Lord put it there for. Now these stirrups, these don't look much like the stirrups you see on a flat saddle, kind that's used in parks, English hunting, that sort of thing. But a cowboy has to have a great big open stirrup, because half the time in mounting a bronc, he isn't going to get time to fish around and set that on his foot. He's got to spear it on the fly, so he wants something as big and heavy that'll be right there so his foot will go right in it. Now, as far as those stirrups are concerned, there's a bit of equipment that goes over them. Here, we call them taps. Most of the expressions you have in cowboy lore are Spanish, Mexican, because the cattle industry came up out of Mexico, came up into Texas and the border states, then moved on up north. So with it came a language that came out of the south. And these were called tapaderos. Now this protection for the feet, those taps fit right over the stirrup, and down in that southern country where they have a lot of brush, chaparral, cactus, they're a great protection because they keep cactus spines and thorns from running into a man's feet. I can remember one time when we used to wear them up north, too. Not so much for brush, because we weren't in such a brushy country, but we wore them in the wintertime, and we lined them with heavy, heavy sheepskin, just to keep our feet warm. So there's a reason for those things. Cowboy expression is taps, chaps, and latigo straps. Now, chaps is nothing but an abbreviation of the word chaparreros. Now, this chaparrero comes from what the Spanish used to call armas. It meant armor or protection. And then they came to these armetas, which were very short, and then the chaparrera, which a man would wear in the brush, and those leather chaps, you see, protect a man going through rough brush and keep him from getting all skinned up. Now, these ornaments, these conchos down the side, yes, they're ornamental, but they have a purpose also. They hold the rings, you see, that snap the inside of those bat-wing chaps. Now, some chaps are made without those, and the legs are sewn right up solidly. That's why I call them stovepipe legs. So you put your foot right in them like you would a stovepipe. Now, we've got a number of chaps around here somewhere. Oh, here's the type that we used to use up in our country that might interest you. You don't see them down south, but they all wore them up north. That's the Angoras. Now, in the wintertime, Now, as I was saying a little while ago, that I realize very few of you fellows have ever been up over this Chisholm Trail. Some things about it you ought to know. All this trailing cattle north, you know, is a new business. But it's something we've got to get used to because it's going to mean the salvation of Texas. Now, a lot of you fellows I know are ex-Confederate soldiers. You've come back home to Texas. What'd you find? You found cattle all over the countryside. Why, even old man Maverick hasn't branded one in years. Texas is rich in land and cattle. The only thing she hasn't got is money. Now, this Chisholm Trail is going to be the salvation of Texas, as I started to tell you a minute ago. It's all right to have cattle. It's all right to have land. But you've got to sell those cattle in order to maintain the land. And the luckiest thing that's happened to us is that they're beginning to build these railroads out across the western states to the north. All we've got to do is round up our Texas cattle, trail them north, load them on the railroads, and ship them to the eastern markets. Now, you know, the East has had to build up, too, after this war. You've got all those big manufacturing centers back there in the Yankee country. It's all right to work, but they have to eat. And they got to have beef. And we've got the beef. So the Yanks and the Rebs are going to get together. We're going to keep them eating, and they're going to keep us alive. So let's look at it that way. You know, this Chisholm Trail, as I started to say to you a minute ago, was a very fortunate thing. The way it came about was that soon after the war began, the Union government decided that the best thing to do was remove a lot of these Indians, get them out of the way so they wouldn't go on the warpath. So they moved them away up into Kansas, near a place called Caldwell. Now, at the end of the war, just in 1867, just a few years ago, they wanted to move those Indians back down into the Indian Territory, so they hired an old, well, he was a half-breed Cherokee. His name was Jesse Chisholm, and that's how this trail gets its name. Let me show you what he did. Here, I brought a map along here because we got to figure out where we're going. We've got to know where we are all the time. So what they did from way up here in this Kansas country, around this Caldwell, Kansas, was to hire Jesse Chisholm to build a trail all the way down here around this country near Fort Cobb, so they could trail all those Indians back. Now that meant the Indians, squaws, papooses, travois, lodges, all the government troops that are going to escort them down there, all your teamsters with the supplies. Naturally, these rivers, just look here. Here you've got the Washita and the Canadian and the Cimarron, clear down to the Red River. But there are a lot of bad crossings on those rivers. So old Jesse figured the best way to do it was to take about 100 head of Indian ponies. Whenever he hit one of those cut banks, he'd run them off there until he'd knocked it down and really made a place for those wagon trains to go through. So that trail has been built all the way, let's say, from Fort Cobb up here to around Caldwell, Kansas. And that's where we're going with these critters. We're going to follow that trail. Now, you see, down here in Texas, we've got a lot of feeder trails now that come in here, and we cross the Red River. We just come to the east of Fort Cobb. We hit that Chisholm Trail and carry on up north, clear on up here to Abilene. Now, you see, that's where that railroad is building. Kansas Pacific is building across from Kansas City. They say they're going all the way to Denver. That's out in Colorado. But right now, the town that we're interested in is this town of Abilene.
It's time for Tim McCoy.
Hilu kumtak silten saika wawa. Na, hilum saika kumtak silten saika wawa.
What? My old friend Chief Ulachi here, he's a Yakima. I was up here visiting him. He started to tell me a story in signs. And then he realized that you who were visiting with us probably didn't understand the signs, and that's what he was telling you in his own language. He was saying, I'll bet you don't know what we were talking about, do you? You know, this sign language of the Plains Indians is very interesting because you can talk to all the Plains tribes, and they'll all understand these same signs. And that's their universal language. So the story he was telling me, well, I'll let him continue the story, and I'll interpret it for you, because it's a story, an old-time legend. You know, all these tribes have their old-time stories. The story goes back and forth all around from one person to another. And they have their legends just as we have the stories of the creation of the world, things of that sort. And what he was telling was one of their great characters, Yell. You spell that Y-E-H-L. Up in the Northwest, among those North Pacific Indians, Yell is a great fellow. And most of the time, he took the form of a raven. You see, with the wings, he's black, and had this great beak. Now, this raven used to play a lot of tricks. But I'll let Ulachi tell you the story, and then I'll interpret it for you. Now he's going to go ahead. And they all start out when we say, once upon a time, the Indians always say, long time ago. So that's how we started. Long time ago, the raven, Yell, looked down and saw these Indian people.
Na. Ti. Mati.
Sun and moon. Now, the moon is a night sun. Night covers over and day opens out. Night sun, the moon, and stars that twinkle up there in the sky, cross, you can see the points of them. They didn't exist. No. The negative, you see. So the sun, the moon, and the stars didn't exist. So the raven looked down.
Who?
He wanted to give these red people happiness. Now, happiness, the heart is gay, everything is lively. So he changed himself. To exchange, you see, just exchanged his personality. He changed himself into a baby, into a child that had been born. And that child was possessed or belonged to the daughter. Now, that's a woman. They combed their hair. A man is that way. A woman, the way they wore their hair. The woman, child, meaning the daughter, of a great medicine man. Now, big, great medicine man. He was powerful.
Go.
It's time for Tim McCoy.
Most people are interested in the jewelry work of our Southwest Indians. We've heard so much about it, we've seen a certain amount of it. So I've laid out this collection of Navajo jewelry for you to look at today. Now, this represents some of the best work that these Navajos turn out. As you look at these things, they all represent something. You've got belts, necklaces, rings, earrings, bracelets. In the first place, where do these people live? Take a look at that map over on the board there. Now that map will show you that this Navajo reservation is in the northern part of Arizona and New Mexico, and of course spills over the line to the north. And in the center is the Hopi. Now that's where the best of your jewelry work comes out of. Of course the Zunis do some remarkable work too. But the Navajo is what I'm particularly interested in now. Now with these Navajos, so many people think that this jewelry work has come down through the centuries, that the Indians have been doing that from the time of Montezuma. But these North American Indians didn't know anything about this jewelry work. They didn't know anything about weaving, and it was taught them by somebody else. Now the Navajos first learned about jewelry making from the Mexicans, or the Spaniards, Mexicans, then the Indians. And the first Navajo that ever learned anything about working with metals was an old Navajo by the name of Hosteen Atsidi. And at Fort Defiance, where the Navajos were held, you know, these Navajos weren't always in one place as they are today. They were roaming wild around the country, and they were some of the greatest warriors this country ever knew. And when they talk about the Apache, few people realize that the Apache and the Navajo were just like that. They roamed together on the plains, and they came south together. So they were kept up around Fort Defiance. While they were there, this Hosteen Atsidi got to work with some of the Mexican smiths, iron workers. And the first things they made were bits, bridle bits. And from iron they went into silver, then they taught the silver to the Zuni, then they taught it to the Hopi, and they interchanged the ideas. Now, as you can see on that map, they surround the whole Hopi reservation. So it's not surprising that the Hopis would become good jewelry workers too. Now, I want to show you something about some of these patterns here. When you see these, you'll be able to know something about them. Now, this, for instance, is a necklace, and in the center of that necklace is Najahe. That's what the Navajo calls it. That means anything that's in a crescent. Some people say that this represents the moon, the crescent moon. But other Navajos tell me that they have always believed it to mean the Hogan. Here's the door of the Hogan, which is the Navajo's house, and this little ornament that you'll always find in the center is the fire in the center of the Hogan, because all of their social life is built around the fire. That's true of all Indians, you know. So this Nadja really represents the Indian's home. Here's another, the squash blossom, or pomegranate. They stand for romance, love, courtship, all that sort of thing. Now these beads are not solid, they're hollow, and each is made in a mold, half of it. Then they're put together and soldered together, so you can see the work that goes into that. You know how long it's taken a Navajo to make that. And there's your squash blossom. Many people have an idea, you know, that all the designs on this jewelry tells a story, but that's not true. Those designs are merely designs that the Navajos are familiar with. The jewelry is new to them. They've only been doing it for about 100 years.
The Indian tells you it's time now for another true story of the West. And their friend is the man who knows the real West and its exciting history. Yes, it's time once again for Tim McCoy.
this is Deadwood. Deadwood and the Black Hills. You know, the very mention of the word Deadwood conjures up a picture of the Deadwood stage being attacked by Indians. Deadwood Dick, you know, holding up people, bad men of the Old West. The Black Hills, Pasapa, the great medicine Black Hills of the Sioux Nation. And here we are. Isn't it strange how well, you go back and think about these places and the things that happened in these places. When Deadwood Gulch was filled with Indians, if they dare go in there. And then there was the gold strike and people poured in there from all over. First thing you know, saloons like this were built up along the gulch, and then it turned out to be a city. Big town. And into it poured all the riffraff and all the decent people that made up all of our old boom towns in the West. Well, you had people, when I was mentioning about Deadwood Dick, for instance, look at this old rascal here. Now take that old fellow, for instance. It shows you what happens in some of these towns. You know, people try to perpetuate the romance and the history of our Old West. And how could you do it better than Deadwood Dick? That's, of course, the funny part of it is, you know, there wasn't any such fellow. There never was a fellow called Deadwood Dick. Back in the old days when these dime novels were being written, you know, Deadwood Dick was just the brainchild of a writer back east, back in New York, a fellow who'd never been out west. So he started writing those fantastic tales about Deadwood Dick, the two-gun bandit of the West. Well, they picked it up, people believed it. They talked about Deadwood Dick, and then it was forgotten. Well, a few years back, people of Deadwood wanted to have a big celebration. They called it Deadwood Days, Frontier Days, Historical Days, whatever they wanted to call it. But they decided to have a great parade, historical pageant, showing sort of the progress of Pasapa, the Black Hills. Then somebody said, when they thought about the different characters, well, we ought to have somebody representing Calamity Jane, and Wild Bill, and General Custer. And then someone said, but what about Deadwood Dick? What would you do about Deadwood Dick? So they got an old-timer, fellow with a long handlebar mustache, and they dressed him all up, put him in the parade. He was to represent Deadwood Dick. They put buckskins on him, and he was just the sort of guy to do it. Long mustache, as I say, and he was just about the right age. So he was Deadwood Dick in the parade. Well, next day, he took off his buckskins and went back to his job in the livery barn, and everything was all right, and he was forgotten until another year. Parade came off next year, and they said, well, say, do you remember we had Deadwood Dick in the parade? Let's get the old boy out again. So they did this for about 3 years. He would come out for one day and be Deadwood Dick, and the next day he went back, as I said, to the livery barn or whatever his job happened to be at the moment. He was just an old roustabout around there. Well, then President Coolidge was going to take a vacation. He was going out west somewhere, and they said, we've got it. Let's send an invitation back to him by Deadwood Dick to come out and spend his summer in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Well, you always remember the pictures of Coolidge with the chaps and the Stetson hat on his head. They were rather funny, but Cal fell for it and came right out. Well, what they did with this old boy then, here's the costume they put on him. They fixed him all out in a buckskin shirt, beaded gauntlets and a big sash on his waist and a Stetson hat, said, you take this invitation back to Mr. Coolidge. So he went back, saw the president, delivered the invitation, and one look at him, he looked like all the old Western outlaws put together. Deadwood Dick was inviting the president personally. Well, as you know, Coolidge accepted the invitation.
Join us again for another true story of the West as told by Tim McCoy.